good morning, everyone, and welcome to Harnessing the Power of Neurodiverse Talent. I'm really excited to welcome Joseph Muscat as our guest this morning. Joseph, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
If you guys can hear and see us, we would appreciate if you could just write a quick comment so we know that the stream is working properly as it should. And I would like to remind you that throughout this live stream, you will be able to ask your questions by using the comments section. So just type it in there and the questions will show up on the screen, and Joseph or myself, depending on to whom you'd like to address the question, will answer. So without any further ado, just a quick intro on Joseph. Joseph brings his experience of neurodiversity to his professional life and to theories and studies conducted on this condition. He adds a unique perspective and storytelling to this area of specialty of neurodiversity. Joseph is from Malta, but he was born in Toronto, Canada, and received his education at the York University, where he earned a Bachelor's of Art with honors degree. In 2014, his family left Canada and moved their life and businesses to Malta. Together with his wife, Joseph continues the family's successful business of professional photography and the commercial industry business, along with a neurodiversity consulting company. If you would like to talk more with Joseph, his email address is showing now on the screen, so feel free to reach out to him. So, Joseph, let's get into. Before we start, I think it would be a good idea that we frame a little bit the discussion today. If you could give us, the definition, if you will, for a better word, of neurodiversity and neurodivergent individuals.
Sure. Well, neurodiversity was coined in 1997 by Jody Singer, who was writing a thesis paper trying to understand her own particular family history with neurodiversity, and as well as comparing it to biodiversity. So when we take a look at neurodiversity, it's defined as in regards to how we all think differently. When we compare it to biodiversity, it is looking at how in nature, how everything works in unison, regardless of how different animals, insects, nature is, and they all have a place and purpose in the environment. Now, since then, neurodiversity has expanded to include a number of particular different definitions. So, in this conversation, when we're talking about neurodiversity, we are talking about under the umbrella in regards to dyslexia, ADHD, Tourette's, autism, development, language development, development coordination disorder, or dypraxia, and those are the items that we are talking about in regards to neurodiversity.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. And in the context of businesses that are hiring individuals, would you be able to share with us some benefits that businesses would be able to harness and develop by tapping into the neurodiverse talent pool?
Sure. When we talk about neurodiversity, it's important when we develop the proper mindset in regards to cultural add. Now, cultural add is a counter to cultural fit. When we're talking about cultural add, we're talking about looking outside of who you usually hire to bring in a different perspective, a different skill set or view of how things will be done. So when we take a look at neurodiversity and you're looking at hiring or bringing in individuals who are neurodivergent, you're bringing in that different perspective. So the benefits to companies, for example, who are become more inclusive and diverse towards neurodiverse talent, they have the opportunity to potentially become more competitive and increase their business by 28%. And it all falls under this cultural add perspective of being inclusive and being supportive of individuals who think and perform differently.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I would like to unpack a little bit the cultural fit that what you started with, because in the context of recruitment and HR alike, there has been a proactive focus, if you will, to include diversity across the board. But if we look at the general behavior in the HR context, I think more often than not, we will notice that diversity kind of looks the same sometimes, doesn't it? Is it really, diversity, which, lends itself into the cultural fit. I think we can all identify a little bit when we receive feedback, we're looking for someone to fit within our culture, So what does that mean? And how is that affecting businesses' ability to attract neurodivergent talent when there is that focus and display of cultural fit?
That's a very good question. In one hand, cultural fit can be important in the sense of you obviously want people who will feel comfortable working in your particular environment with the people that and the people that you have brought together, and there's obviously this cohesiveness that you're looking for. The same time, there's the danger in the fact that you are excluding individuals where it can become somewhat, unfortunately, discriminatory, even though that's not your intention. And when that happens, then what does cultural fit mean when you're excluding individuals? And when you're excluding individuals, those individuals could very well be a good fit, but you're excluding them because your definition of cultural fit is very narrow rather than being wider. And that's where, again, the cultural ad comes into play. The cultural ad is creating a different mindset of saying, okay, we have this cultural fit. Now, who can we include outside of that cultural fit that would still be a good fit, but add that different perspective, that different insight into how we perform and do things? And as a result of that, when we focus just on cultural fit, what will happen is during, let's say, the job advert, for example, and particularly in how it's written, and that's another aspect we can get into, is that it excludes a lot of individuals because when they take a look at that, they're saying, even though I may check all the boxes for the skill sets that they're looking for, based on what they're describing in regards to what they're looking for in the context of cultural fit, I won't be applying because obviously I'm not the right candidate.
Mhm. That's very interesting in terms of job adverts and using language that excludes rather than includes. And I'm a very big fan of the power of example. Would you be able to perhaps, if you can think of, one or two, phrases that are used in job adverts that is off-putting or excludes neurodiverse talent by the language used?
I can definitely do that, but I want to go a little bit more deeper into that for just a moment. When we
Sure.
take a look at job adverts, I'm always, as a perfect analogy, when I look back at my school days, as well as when I was looking at becoming a writer, and the the constant analogy used is that you're not writing for yourself; you're writing for the audience. So quite often when people write, they're thinking about what they would want to see and how they will want to read it, and not thinking about the people to who they're writing it for. So as a result, when we go back to the example of the cultural fit, for example, they're writing in the sense of what they're looking for and not thinking about the people who are reading it, who look at it and say, okay, this job advert is not for me. Part of that as well is when we look at the job advert, because it's not being written in a very simplistic format and not focusing on essential skills, I see a lot of job adverts that are basically essays or novels in the making,
Yes.
rather than being focused on the short essential skills that would attract the right talent. And then, of course, when we're thinking about how we're writing and we're not thinking about the audience that we're writing for, then, of course, we're going to use language that the audience cannot relate to. So, for example, I was looking at one a few weeks ago, natural learner.
Mm.
Okay, well, what's a natural learner? Are you basing a natural learner by your standards where you learn within 30 days? Well, what happens if someone who comes in takes a full 60 days or 90 days to learn? Is that someone not a natural learner because that's how they learn naturally? Or good communication skills? Again, good communication skills. We all can communicate, we all communicate in different ways. So, what is defined as being good communication skills? Or natural leader? Well, again, depending on the circumstances, depending on the environment, depending on the task, we are all can become natural leaders
Leaders.
um, in based on those circumstances and based on the right conditions. So, what does that mean? I mean, those are all very vague, very double meaning. And as well, again, based on the reader's perspective, they're going to rule themselves as not being a good fit when in actuality, there could be the perfect candidate that that company is looking for.
That's a very, very compelling summary with regards to advertising. And if I could tie in a little bit what you said with regards to writing for the audience. I don't know if we have anyone in marketing or copywriting listening to this, but this is something that the marketing and the copywriting community has been preaching forever, is to write as you speak, in the sense of using simple, direct language, and to write for the audience, for the person reading. And this is something that not only improves the application rate, like you said, for job adverts, but it can also improve the quality of applications within job adverts as well. Because if you create that basic connection, in being clear in your language, and you give people a reason to apply, then naturally they're going to feel more comfortable with that. And with regards to what you said on natural learn and have excellent communication skills and be a natural leader, I agree with you. Those are very subjective metrics, that we tend to assess individuals on. Like you said, what natural learner, I mean, on whose benchmark are we comparing the learning ability, and how do we measure that in the context of the job as well? So I think these are very key points that we can all take on board and consider when we write job adverts, having the audience in mind, like you said, using clear and concise language that is related to the job itself, rather than how we perceive the measure of ability, whatever that ability may be. And in your experience, Joseph, because you train organizations in adopting inclusive practices, but you also coach a lot of individuals into, like, to use the title of our discussion today, harnessing their power and making the most out of their career. What would you say that is one of the key elements within the interview process that is not particularly inclusive for neurodiverse talent?
That's a very good question. And I would say not key element, but key elements. There are a particular lot of things that we need to break down in regards to interview process. And it starts off in regards to the prep to the interview. Now, when we take a look at the prep to the interview, what are managers and hiring managers doing to prepare for that interview, to make it more inclusive? Are they thinking about the environment that they're bringing that individual into? Particularly when we take a look at sensory issues and sensory concerns. Is it going to be a quiet room? Is the lighting right? This, the particular lighting can be picked up that we cannot see, or what a neurotypical cannot see, but a neurodivergent can see, depending on the neurodivergent, which can lead to migraines and difficulty in focusing and concentrating. Then, of course, when we have to take a look at, we have to give individuals time to process information. So neurodivergents have difficulty with executive function. So when we take a look at executive function, we're talking about being able to plan, being able to manage. That then comes into regards to working memory, being able to recall information, and that, of course, that leads into processing speed, where it's being able to have the time to be able to receive the questions, being able to time to process those questions, and have the time to be able to respond to those questions. So obviously then it's not going to be a half-hour interview. It may very well be an hour to a 2-hour interview. They give them time to be able to process that information and to be able to display their skill sets effectively and their experience to be able to answer those questions. Then, of course, in regards to that, are we just asking surface questions, or are we asking in-depth questions that will be able to pull out that information? And then that's the prep for the hiring manager to do. Now, depending on the neurodivergent or just even neurotypicals in general, and let me pause there because I've used neurotypicals twice now. Neurotypicals is what's considered to be a normal individual. When in actuality, a neurotypical is one type of diversity, but it's what's the current standard of society is. Mm-hmm. Neurodivergence are individuals under the spectrum of neurodiversity who have a particular neurodivergence. So we're all neurodiverse, but some of us have, again, particular neurodivergence, or diversity, should I say, which is dyslexia, ADHD, or autism. So I would be considered a neurodivergent because I'm visual perception, working memory, visual motor, and dyslexia. So when we go back to that in regards to the interview process, are you sending information to them in regards to being able to know where to find the location, know where to park, what's the best bus route? Then we could potentially send them a video or photos of what the place looks like, who are they going to meet. So that's another particular aspect. When we take a look at sending information for who that person's going to meet for the job interview, who is conducting the interview, what is their profile, what is their picture. And then when we go back to the questions, send them the questions so they can be prepared for the questions. So that way they will hopefully not only inform them, but also be able to speed up the process and how they're going to answer those questions. So those are quite a lot of information there in regards to preparation. Now, the other aspect in regards to doing the job interview, if it goes obviously longer than 45 minutes, give them a break. So that way they can recenter and recharge from responding to those questions, because it gets very tiring to be able to answer questions, to be able to process those questions when we go back to executive function and how executive function, which is understanding how the human brain works in regards to working memory and processing speed. And part of that as well is, are we creating an unstructured interview, or are we creating a structured interview? So what do I mean by that? An unstructured interview is where the interviewer comes in and just works on their experience and guts on how they're going to assess that individual and whether that person is going to be a right fit or a right cultural fit. Whereas if we look at a structured interview, you have the going by instinct, but you also have going by examination. So are you providing an examination in regards to that particular skill set of being able to do the job? And when I say examination, are we looking at an examination that's both paper as well as practical? So you can have a theory given and then do is a practical. So for example, you're looking to hire someone who can do data entry and who knows how to use Excel. Okay, well, what does that exactly mean, knowing to use Excel and being specific about what you're looking for in Excel? So obviously you're going to provide a theory and examination, and then you're going to provide an actual Excel exercise where they'll be inputting and showing their skills in regards to that particular task and skill set. And that is will help narrow down and show that this individual can actually do the job. Because at the end of the day, when you look at a job advert and the interview, are you getting someone who is confident, or are you getting someone who is able to actually perform the task?
That's a fantastic point, Joseph. Are you looking for someone who's confident or someone who can actually perform the task? I think we can all bear this in mind moving forward. And I'd like to take you back slightly because this ties in if we're looking for someone confident or someone who can perform the task in the area of unstructured interviews, where the interviewer just goes on a whim. Okay, let's, we walk into the room and see how this is going to pan out. Apart from the fact that it will perhaps be very difficult then to remember what actually happened at the interview, even for the interviewer themselves, if it's very unstructured and just go off on a whim. How does that harm the chances of neurodivergent individuals if they are to go through that sort of process?
Well, if you're looking at an unstructured aspect and none of that preparation that I just described was done, it depends on the neurodivergent. So, for example, they may have difficulty in processing the questions. So they'll have difficulty in being able to respond correctly. The other aspect is, this is where confirmation bias comes into play, and unconscious bias and conscious bias comes into play, where we're basing it on presentation.
Mm-hmm.
All right. If the person that, what is the within a second, you'll know whether or not this is a person you're going to like or not. And that's an automatic conscious or unconscious bias that's coming into play. And that attitude comes into play in regards to the whole entire interview and that judgment of that the way that person performed during that interview. So then, of course, then we get into particular body language or social norms. So if someone who's autistic and doesn't feel comfortable looking into someone's eyes, or they're fidgeting and they're moving about, or even if they're pausing to think about how they're going to answer, this all leads into potentially being viewed as a bad presentation. And this is also in regards to, sometimes I see where recruiters say to candidates, make sure you give a firm handshake, make sure you look them in the eye, make sure that you're quick to respond with questions. Okay, well, this is fine if you're neurotypical, but if you're someone who's neurodiverse, I mean, even now during this interview right now, you're seeing me moving about, taking pauses, stumbling with my words. This is how I'm processing information and how I'm able to respond during an interview process. Depending on the hiring manager, how is that going to be interpreted? So all of this in its unstructured form can be a barrier to the candidate who's neurodivergent, rather than giving me the opportunity to process information, to be able to show off my skill set, and at the same time being able to communicate my experiences and to be able to show my skill set in a proper format.
That's a fantastic point, particularly with regards to how we experience different interview formats and different situations. And I will share an example. I am very sensitive to particular textures or fabrics, for example. And I remember that once I was going for a meeting, and the material of the chair was very disturbing to me, and I could not focus at all in that meeting, because all I could think of is to set that chair on fire, essentially,
Yeah.
because it bothered me so much, to the point that all I could think about was the texture of the chair. And this is something that, it's very easy to miss. I mean, one would not think that the person in front of you is very fidgety and, display, you can sense that I'm not comfortable because of the texture of the chair. So, simple things like that. And then I'm really, really glad we're having this conversation, Joseph, because by creating awareness of these situations, we can all then, whether we are interviewing or are interviewing ourselves, because the interviewer themselves could be a neurodivergent individual as well. We can open our mind to better understand reactions, and to be more accommodating and understanding of these reactions. And we have a very interesting comment here, based on what you said, Joseph, that interview performance is a different skill than actually doing the job. And that is, I think, a universal truth.
Well, it is. I usually use the analogy of not only the analogy, but I also consider it to be one of the principles of life, which is presentation versus perception. So we automatically perceive somebody based on presentation, and that obviously hinders or gives a conscious bias to who they actually are and what they're actually capable of. So a perfect analogy that I use, that you could be the dumbest person in the world, but if you dress like $1 billion, everybody wants to be your best friend. And you could be the smartest person in the world, but if you dress like a bum, everybody avoids you. And it's all because of that presentation and that perception. And this is exactly what happens during the interview process when someone who's, in particular, someone who's neurodivergent.
That's a great point, and I think it's something that we have all came across at one point in our lives. We have another very interesting question, Joseph, if I may. It's displaying here on the screen, but I'm going to read it out. What are your opinions about a diversity policy where there's information related to accommodations and even language used at the job or at the interview?
Policy is absolutely fantastic. Every company should have an inclusion and diversity policy, particularly geared towards neurodivergency and neurodiversity. The caveat to that, though, is that there needs to be training and awareness, and that policy needs to be enforced. It cannot be a checkbox approach. So you can have a policy, but if managers are not trained in that policy and what the procedures and understanding and awareness of that policy and the skill set that's required for that policy, then it's only 50% of the solution. You need to have the other side of that solution. And that requires training and bringing that awareness to management as well as teams on a regular basis.
And speaking of training, Joseph, what would be the most effective type of training that companies could implement to ensure that the diversity policy is not just a tick box exercise, but it is something that is thoroughly adopted within the business?
Sure, but before we go to that, Fran, if I may, and please keep that question at hand, because I do want to answer it. We need to go back to the interview and recruitment process, which is when we take a look, because we only took a look at two aspects, which is the job advert and the interview. One thing we haven't looked at is the CV and how the CV is constructed. And we also haven't looked at alternatives in regards to the CV and the interview process. So let's quickly, if I may, focus on the CV. So many neurodivergents have difficulty with the construction of the CV and understanding and how to communicate their skills onto a CV. So as a result, when we go back and look at the job advert, if it's focusing on essential skills, for example, or even if it's not, are we highlighting particular keywords that are important to the skill set? That way, a neurodivergent will be able to know how to transplant those keywords into their CV. So to give you an example in regards to construction and communication, I was speaking to a colleague in Canada, speaking of an individual who's autistic, who went through a particular hard time during university and almost dropped out of university because they were completely missed their whole entire life up until the post-secondary in regards to being identified and diagnosed as being autistic. And one of the great challenges that this individual had was writing essays. They couldn't understand, where the thesis went, where the body went, where the conclusion went. It was very difficult situation. So if they're having difficulty in composing a essay, imagine having difficulty in writing a 2 or 4 page CV. So it becomes a very challenge for them. And then of course comes the obstacles of, in my case, grammar and spelling is just out the door. Even if I have Grammarly or spell checker, a perfect example is I quite often get mixed up in writing and speaking specific and Pacific. So if I write Pacific correctly on my CV, Grammarly or spell checker is going to spot that as being correct because it's spelled correctly, not spot that it's the wrong word being used in the sentence. So we have to understand how the tools work. So you may have, with me, a number of errors. So if there's a number of errors, how is that going to be interpreted? And is that automatically excluded me from the process? So alternatives to the CV process is do we not allow video CVs or audio CVs where someone can present and not have to write it out? So that's covering the CV aspect. When we go back to the interview process, another alternative to the interview is doing work sampling, where an individual could come in and spend 2 weeks to a month interviewing for the job. By doing the job, they will see whether or not they're a good fit for the job based on the company and the people they work with. And you would get to see if they're a good fit based on whether or not they know the skill set and they have the skills and they can perform the job. So that is an alternative to the interview process. Now, back to your question, which was remind me now, what kind of training or awareness is needed?
Correct. So you going back to the original question in regards to the diversity policy, one of the key areas you've mentioned is for the business to actually implement that. So training is naturally a key part of that. What form of training would be best for businesses to adopt to ensure that the diversity policy works in practice?
Fantastic. So again, it starts off with having the training and understanding what neurodiversity is and understanding the different types of neurodivergence out there. So what is dyslexia? What is ADHD? What is Tourette's? And so forth. Now, that also leads into breaking away from the most extreme understanding. So if we go back to, let's say, ADHD, and we commonly think of ADHD where someone is unable to focus and concentrate, and they're a big distraction to everyone. Okay, well, that is only 15% of the population. What about the other 85% of the population and how they perform and process? What are the different levels and thresholds of ADHD that is not being talked about and is what's the word I'm looking for? Not being talked about, and that is being overshadowed by this large
Mm,
stereotype of ADHD.
mm,
So so that brings up a number of examples. So, for example, I was coaching someone and getting in regards to her dyslexia and going for an interview, and she said to the interviewee, you know, just to let you know, I'm dyslexic. And the interviewee said, well, what's that? Followed by, oh, you mean having difficulty reading? That won't be a problem. Well, she doesn't have a difficulty reading, but that was the extreme case example that they were only aware of. So it
mhm,
brings into effect understanding the different aspects of one particular neurodiversity. The other aspect is understanding that neurodiversity greatly affects cognitive function, which again goes back to executive function, working memory, processing speed, uh, sensory issues, and so forth. What does that mean? That means, understanding how the human brain works and understanding how these particular issues and concerns affects their ability to perform, and what are the solutions and support that can be provided to that individual. The third aspect to that is understanding accommodations and what a reasonable accommodations are. So, for example, I use the example of Grammarly. Having Grammarly is a simple accommodation that can be provided to me or to someone who's dyslexic, who will be able to that will be able to have that tool to support them in regards to their writing. Another, in addition to that, having someone be able to review what they have written is another simple accommodation, because they may have had Grammarly, but as I said in my example, Grammarly is as great tool as it is not perfect
mm,
and will not be able to aid in particular language issues in regards to someone's dyslexia. But having someone be able to proofread that will be able to hopefully be able to add that reasonable accommodation and add that additional support. So there's understanding what neurodiversity is, there's understanding what cognitive function and how that applies to neurodiversity, and there's understanding what reasonable accommodations are and how to be able to provide reasonable accommodations.
mm.
When we look at all three of those, that not only educates employers and managers and human resources and colleagues, but it also removes the barriers that interferes with one's ability to perform, or hopefully removes the stigma that exists.
That's a very compelling point, particularly with regards to reasonable accommodations. And I would like to make a small parenthesis there in the context of job skills. For example, in your case, you've mentioned that as you have dyslexia, Grammarly is very useful. It's a tool that helps you in performing. But I think it's also a question that for companies, depending on the situation at hand, to ask themselves, how is, for example, in your case, how important is actually writing in this job? And yes, we accommodate with Grammarly, but do we really need to use very colloquial and very simplistic terms, make a big fuss of it in the sense as, how important is the writing part to the actual job? Because if it is a small part in the context of the overall job performance, then it's something that, like you said, it is actually a very minor accommodation in the context of performing the job. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. And I would add even an additional caveat to that, which is okay, I presented a presentation, let's say a PowerPoint presentation. It had a number of errors in the slide presentation. Okay. But how was my performance of presenting the information? Did I show that I was knowledgeable? Were you able to understand the what I was presenting and the meaning of what I was presenting? You know, did that affect my performance? No, it did not. Because at the end of the day, you were happy with what I was communicating effectively. So my bad grammar or my bad spelling had nothing to do. That is your bias, because you want to be picky about spelling and grammar.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And this can be extrapolated to, even in the context of talking about neurotypical selection, very briefly, that we put together. I use, the colloquial bullet points, 12, 15, 16 bullet points of, you need to do this and you need to do that and you need to do the other. But each of that point in itself, how important is actually in the context of performing the job. And I think this is something we should all, bear in mind. And there is another very interesting question as well, is whether you would recommend that someone discloses their neurodiversity at an interview or even pre-interview stage.
That's a very good question. And it's a catch-22, frankly. I
Yeah.
personally advocate to disclose because you need to become an advocate for yourself. That's the only way that you are going to be able to not have to mask, not have to, and hopefully remove the stigma that is existing and confront the problem head on. Now, again, it's a catch-22 because you're going to see in particular circumstances where they are going to make issue of that, and they will find a way in how to not want to hire that particular individual. Or you may get through the interview process, you may get the job, and down the road, in regards to the performance of your job, you're going to run into a problem or problems where your neurodiversity is going to be showing. And at that point, you're going to have to disclose. And that could be potentially met with hostility with the person you're disclosing to. And the most common thing will be like, well, I wish you would have told me that you were from the beginning. So again, now that's placing the blame on the
Mm,
individual without understanding that individual was afraid to disclose because of past previous experiences.
mm,
And now it now puts them even more on the defensive because now they're going to be afraid that their future in their job is not going to be a long future because they didn't disclose from the very beginning. So
mm.
disclosure, the most common thread when it comes to disclosure is this: are you creating a safe environment from the very beginning? And if you're creating a safe environment from the very beginning, there's no need for someone to disclose. So that's where we add into the aspect of universal design principles. Now,
Mhm.
if you're not familiar with what universal design is, universal design principles is that you are thinking about everybody and anybody that you want to include and what are their needs where it is a safe environment for them. So let's go back to the Grammarly example. Let's say, for example, I disclose, I ask for Grammarly, and you give me Grammarly. And then you buy a corporate account for Grammarly. And when you go on the back end to see the stats of how actively I'm using Grammarly, to what you didn't know is that I'm not the only one using Grammarly. All of a sudden, another 25 people are using Grammarly. And they're using Grammarly because not only is it accessible to them, but they're using it because one third of them are neurodivergent as well, but never wanted to disclose. So now, by providing Grammarly for me, you're now supporting them. Another one third could be third party nationals who don't feel comfortable as English as their second language. And now they have a tool to help them feel more comfortable because they had that. So because you provided one tool for me, you're now helping another 25 people. Now there could be the final one third of that 25 who are native English speakers but don't feel comfortable or confident with their native language. So now they have this tool that is supporting them. So all of a sudden, you've implemented a tool that's not helping one person, but it's helping another 25 individuals. And this is where universal design comes into play. So another example of that is that you put a ramp, and you put a ramp originally for delivery people. But now that ramp is being used by people who are in wheelchairs, who are in strollers, or using walkers to help them walk, or may have issues with their knees by using the stairs. So you thought you were solving one problem, but you were actually solving multiple problems. And it becomes a cost saving factor for you in the long run. So by applying these particular tools and applying universal divine principles, there is no need for disclosure.
Mm. Thank you for that, Joseph. I think that's a very interesting and compelling way to understand the um the benefits. I was looking for the right word, the benefits of inclusiveness, because it does create, as you've described it, a ripple effect that benefits everyone. And one of the things that you've mentioned, but perhaps um, as the example that you've used, if the employer provides Grammarly in this instance, for you, then other people are using it who, are also neurodivergent, but they haven't disclosed it, which brings me to my next point, that I'd like us to cover slightly is, how many individuals in the workplace are actually neurodivergent, but they are not aware, or their employer is not aware, because it can also be, that it takes some time for the individuals themselves to be aware whether they fall under the spectrum or not. And if that has been successful to date, then we should feel less afraid, let's say, of creating even more inclusive policies. What do you think?
That's a tricky one, Fran. That's a very tricky one, because the reality is that we do have stats, but the stats are not accurate.
Mhm.
There is no, in Malta, there is no national uh, statistics in regards to who are neurodivergent. In fact, I was watching a debate yesterday in the UK in regards to providing support for neurodiversity disclosure, and not only disclosure, but providing better education and awareness. And even the UK does not have national stats on neurodiversity. Now, there are individual independent stats, but even then, it's debatable for a number of reasons, because a number of people don't want to disclose, or because a number of individuals have not been properly diagnosed and having a late diagnosis. So let's take a look at what the numbers are and what the numbers really are. So, based on what the numbers are estimated to be, we're looking at about worldwide, we're looking at about 1,460,000 people. So let's make that smaller. That means on average, what 4 out of 20 individuals are neurodivergent. So
Mhm.
that means 4 out of 20 students, 4 out of 20 employees, 4 out of 20 customers, 4 out of 20 business owners are neurodivergent. Now, those are what the statistics that we have. Let's look at the reality of the situation. The reality situation is, again, a large portion of the population is undiagnosed. So if we take a look at women, women are 73% undiagnosed with ADHD and with autism. People of color or minorities are also hugely undiagnosed due to discrimination and stereotypes. Depending on what country you come from, third party nationals are most likely undiagnosed because that particular country does not want to recognize neurodiversity. So, for example, if you're someone coming from Asia, China or Malaysia or even Philippines, there is a unwillingness to recognize one's neurodiversity, or even unwillingness to diagnose someone who's neurodivergent. So in actuality, is it 20% of the world's population, or is it 30 to 40%? Is it 4 out of 20, or is it 10 out of 20? That's the reality of the situation when we take a look at what the numbers are.
Thank you for sharing that, Joseph. And definitely does help to gain perspective on the situation, which leads me to my next and almost final question. So just a small parenthesis here. If anyone has any other questions, please do write them in the comments, as we're nearing the last 10 minutes of the live podcast. And we would also appreciate your feedback. If you know what your thoughts are on the discussion so far, if you could let us know in the comments. So back to my point. Give me a second to remind myself of the point I was wanting to make. So, in the context of Malta, okay, in the context of the national strategy of Malta, you are correct, because I was looking last night as well in preparation for our discussion today to see, any statistics with regards to neurodiversity, neurodivergent individuals in Malta or sport, and I couldn't find anything. Maybe I didn't look hard enough, but if you couldn't find, I couldn't find that. What can, from a government strategy, whether it's education or employment or integration strategy, would need to include in order to start tackling this challenge in front of us and create better opportunities for neurodivergent individuals?
Fantastic question. The first thing is obviously awareness. There needs to be more awareness of what neurodiversity is. That awareness needs to be followed up with better support systems in place. We quite often look at neurodiversity as a childhood issue rather than a lifelong diversity. And when we take a look at the system in general, the system has been built for one type of diversity, which is the neurotypicals. And anybody outside of that diversity is considered to have a disability. So we're expected to integrate rather than the system adjusting to us and being inclusive. So when we look at the education system, and that's where it really needs to start, is that there needs to be more awareness and there needs to be more diagnosis. Teachers are only trained to create course, what's what I'm looking for? To I had the term, but I forgot it. But they're trained to create to deliver the course. They're not fully trained in understanding what neurodiversity is and how to support neurodivergence. And of course, if there isn't enough support for that individual and there isn't enough support for diagnosis within the school systems, then that leaves parents to go get it outside the school system, and that can be very cost effective. The other aspect of that, because of that late diagnosis, we're seeing in post-secondary, a lot of post-secondary students struggling in the school system, and where the post-secondary is filling in the gap where they're getting the diagnosis that they should have gotten prior to post-secondary. And we're seeing where there's a burden being done in the post-secondary system where they're trying to provide support for individuals, not only with the diagnosis, but in regards to the support they need to be able to succeed in their post-secondary. And then, of course, the caveat to that is that once they graduate and they enter the workforce, the employers do not understand or are completely unaware of what neurodiversity is. And the attitude is that it doesn't exist or it was cured in the education system. So they're entering the workplace where there is not support. And there's also not enough legal representation or legal support from the government on how to support individuals in the workplace who are neurodivergent. So if we go and take a look at the UK model, for example, they do have legislation in place to ensure that neurodivergents are not discriminated against and there's equal opportunity. And they also have a program called the Right to Work program, where an individual is provided the support they needed and that there's actually government support to help fund that for the company. So there are a lot of particular programs that can be put into place to help companies in being able to support individuals who are neurodivergent, and as well as bringing that awareness all around in society.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Joseph, and hopefully we will start to see movement in this area as well. And we have, a comment here for you as well. Thanking you for the interesting interview. A lot of elephants in the room have been pointed out, and a lot of hands-on tips and valuable insight were given by Joseph. Thank you very much for your kind comment. Joseph, we're now, in the last few minutes. If you could give key advice to HR manager or business owners or hiring managers involved in the recruitment process, some actual tips or steps that they could take to create an immediate improvement, what would those be?
Sure. Well, let's start off with something that we haven't quite talked about, which is a lot of neurodivergents, myself included, deal with self-esteem issues, deal with self-confidence issues, and deal with not being valued for the contribution that we make. And that stems from the education system, that stems from society, that stems from family members, that stems from being in the workplace. So obviously, we need to create an environment where the individual and talent has that self-esteem and that confidence. And that happens in the workplace, and that happens during the interview process. The other aspect to that is during the interview process, I mentioned in regards to barriers. We want to remove barriers because a lot of neurodivergents suffer from, because of their self-esteem, anxiety issues. And then anxiety happens to affect their performance. So what you need to take a look at all the things I've talked about in this interview, is take a look at your organization. Take a look at your current practices and policies and ask yourself, how is this excluding neurodivergent talent? And what can we do to become more inclusive in our policies, in our procedures, in our practices, and in our environments to be inclusive? And the simplest way to do this is you want to create an Excel file. In an Excel file, you want to take a look at what are your current policies and practices on one column. On the second column, who is that excluding? Your third column, what can we change to be more inclusive? And in your fourth column, find somebody in the organization who is willing to speak up and ask them for their opinion, for their particular life experience, because we each all have a different life experience. And when we go back to the awareness training in regards to neurodiversity, yes, there's the textbook understanding, but my experience versus another neurodiverse experience is going to be completely different. So find out from them and ask them, from what you're seeing in this Excel file, what more can we do to be inclusive and to remove those barriers?
Thank you, Joseph. I think that's very, very sound advice and something that we can all easily do if we're honest with ourselves and we are willing to make a change. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, for your valuable insight and tips. I sincerely appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone who has joined us in this live broadcast and for sending us your wonderful comments. I'd like to remind you that if you would like to talk more with Joseph about creating neurodiversity inclusion policies within your business and training, you can reach out to him by writing to the email address below, which is info@josephkmuscat.com, and naturally the website for the same effect, josephkmuscat.com. Joseph, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And I wish you all a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you, everyone, as well.